Undercover boss. Refused service at breakfast joint. Minutes later, everyone gets replaced. You can't sit here. The voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to make the sound of clinking cups. And the scent of cinnamon apple pie in the cafe seemed to pause for a moment. A woman in a light brown uniform, her name tag faintly gleaming gold with the name Claire, the morning shift manager at Maple Cream Cafe, had just looked up from the POS system as she uttered those words. Her eyes weren't angry, but there was a kind of indifference in them, the kind that comes from years of working in the same space, dealing with the same kind of people. 12:03 p.m., Annie's midday. The sun over Old Town blazed like fire, casting harsh reflections off the mirror-like gray stone pavement inside the corner cafe, once known as the creative heart of a generation of entrepreneurs. The air was filled with hurried glances, fingers tapping on phone screens, the grinding whir of the coffee machine, blending with the tired sighs coming from behind the bar. That sentence might have seemed like mere standard procedure, but it wasn't. It was a door slamming shut on something much bigger, like a rejection not just of a man, but of a past he had quietly built here. Michael Foster, 50 years old, walked into the cafe, wearing a slightly wrinkled blue cotton shirt from the early train ride, with a soft gray cardigan draped over it. His hair was salt and pepper, his eyes deep-set, his build tall but unassuming. There was nothing in his demeanor to signal CEO. And if you didn't know, you wouldn't have guessed that this middle-aged man was the founder of the entire Maple and Cream Cafe chain, now famous across the country. A brand built on the promise, a cafe for those who listen. He wasn't here to conduct an inspection. He wasn't here to stir up scandal or film a disguise reveal like those television show CEOs. No one seeks the truth when they already have the answers. But sometimes, only by going back to your roots, facing the place that once moved you, can you discover what has silently decayed from within. Michael hadn't made a reservation. He didn't use any special privileges. He had walked from a nearby bus stop, entered the cafe like any passerby. He chose a small table by the window, the spot where the first light of morning usually touched, the same spot where he and his first business partner once drafted the earliest designs for the brand. The last time he sat there was 8 years ago, when this very location had just been awarded Best Local Breakfast Spot for the second time. And today, he returned. No announcements. No logo. Just a middle-aged man, carrying a bit of nostalgia, hoping to sit down once more, with a cup of black coffee and a slice of apple pie, like before. I'd like to place an order. Michael spoke gently, his tone as steady and quiet as the atmosphere in the cafe. He placed 3 fingers on the tabletop, leaning forward slightly, just like any polite guest would. But Claire didn't step forward to take his order. She simply raised an eyebrow, looked him over from head to toe, then coolly said, "This table is for regulars. If you'd like to sit, please choose another one." Across the bar, a young employee who had been washing cups froze momentarily, but then continued, as if nothing had happened. Michael slowly lifted his head, looking directly at the manager. There was no reproach in his eyes, just something faint, like that moment when you realize a beloved song is now being played out of tune by someone else. Outside, a breeze slipped through the glass door, gently lifting a few silver strands of his hair. A maple leaf floated down and settled on the windowsill, lying still, as if it, too, wanted to hear what was about to unfold. "I just need a black coffee and a slice of apple pie. He won't stay long." His voice didn't tremble, but it was exactly that steadiness that caught people off guard. Claire folded her arms and gave a faint, dismissive smile. "Sorry, sir. We don't serve customers like you." A sentence doesn't have to be direct to be insulting. A little indirectness, a touch of superiority, and a prejudiced glance. That's all it takes. A few eyes in the cafe began to turn toward them, not out of curiosity, but because something felt wrong. Michael didn't respond right away. He calmly pulled out the chair. The soft scrape of the wooden leg against the floor cut through the heavy air, like a fine blade. Then he sat down, placing both hands on the table. Slow, unprovocative, simply the quiet composure of someone who has seen too many things he once believed in. He began to crumble. At that very moment, Sunlight flooded through the window, casting his shadow long across the cafe floor, as if his very memories had just entered the room. And no one in that room knew they had just refused service. To the man who created the reason for this place to exist, Linda Sharp, morning shift manager at Maple Cream Cafe, didn't even lift her eyes from the POS screen. Her voice rang out, sweet as maple syrup, but colder than crushed ice in an espresso. That seat's for VIPs, sir. If you'd like to dine, please take one of the tables at the back, near the dishwashing station. She emphasized the words, at the back, like a quiet verdict that said, you don't belong up front. Michael didn't argue, didn't ask. He simply tilted his head slightly. His eyes followed the direction of her pointing hand toward the small single tables lined up close to the wall. Dimmer, quieter, usually reserved for strangers, walk-ins, or the unwelcome. He nodded, gently, but instead of walking in that direction, he remained where he stood, as if letting time slip silently across the shoulders that once carried the weight of an entire brand. People in the cafe began to glance his way. Some pretended to focus on their laptops, but the dark screen reflected his standing figure. A young woman placed her phone down on the table, just a beat slower than usual. The barista stopped mid-pour with the milk, and even the grinding of coffee beans seemed to slow. Or perhaps that was just the effect of silence creeping in. Linda finally looked up. Her brown eyes scanned Michael's face briefly, then dropped to his faded cardigan and low-cut leather shoes. We have specific policies for the window tables. I hope you understand. Michael still said nothing, but this time, his eyes were no longer wandering. They began to focus, like a still lake tightening. In response to the season's first chill, he looked around once more, not searching for justification, but to feel the change. The old black and white photographs had been replaced by seasonal drink posters. The vintage sycamore wall clock, once a symbol of his first day opening the cafe, had been swapped out for a flashing LED promo screen, and Linda's voice, though soft, couldn't hide what lay beneath. A qui discrimination, masked by surface-level politeness, born from assumptions about appearance, and a distorted view of what customer value means. He didn't argue, but he didn't move either, simply because this was the beginning. A small doorbell chimed at the back. A new customer had arrived. Linda looked up, her face immediately lit with a bright smile. For a man in a neatly pressed suit, she walked over to welcome him without hesitation, leaving Michael behind, as if he had never existed. From behind the bar, a young male employee named Ricky, barely 3 months into the job, glanced at Michael, hesitating, as if he wanted to step forward. But Linda gave a slight flick of her head, cutting him off. Restock the supplies in the back first. Michael saw everything. No reaction. He pulled his phone from his pocket, lit up the screen, but didn't tap anything, just stared for a moment. The screen reflected his face. Still him. Michael Foster, the man who once spent sleepless nights in this very cafe, drafting the first blueprint for a community cafe model. He turned off the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then once again, he looked toward the table by the window. Silently, no demand, no posturing. But that silence, to a few in the room, was the loudest voice they had heard all day. Linda turned back, and this time her voice was fully cold. If you don't choose another table, I'll have to refuse service. An older man sitting in the corner sighed. A young woman snapped a photo of the moment with her phone, not to share it, but because she felt something was wrong, deeply wrong, with how this cafe was being run. Michael pressed his lips together. His eyes remained fixed on the large glass pane outside, where the reflection of the maple and cream logo overlapped with his own shadow. And only he knew every reflection was a reminder that his own system had started to betray itself. A moment of hesitation. Then from behind the bar, Derek, a thin young server, with messy hair not yet tidied, walked hesitantly toward him. With a stiff smile, he wiped his hands on a cloth, eyes nervously darting to Michael, then almost immediately flicking to Linda, who stood behind the counter with her arms crossed. She didn't say a word, but the slight raise of her eyebrow was loaded with implication. And to Derek, it felt like a silent command. I'm sorry, sir, Derek said softly. his voice a little shaky. "We have a policy to reserve these inner tables for regular customers. Would you mind sitting out on the patio instead?" His voice sounded like a pre-recorded message, not delivered from personal intent, but under pressure. Each word seemed tethered to an invisible string pulled backward toward Linda. Her glance, her slight nod, like a puppeteer pulling on a marionette. Michael didn't rush to respond. He simply looked straight at Derek. There was no anger in his gaze, no reproach, only a silence so heavy it seemed to freeze the air. No one said a word. A little girl who had been biting into a croissant suddenly froze mid-bite. The spoon in an elderly lady's hand hung suspended in midair. A man in a suit at the far end of the cafe quietly lowered his eyes over his newspaper. Michael stepped forward, just half a step, toward a small shelf where the menus were kept, light brown paper menus, the dish names printed in elegant serif font. He pulled one out, opened it slowly. "I'll sit here." His voice wasn't loud, wasn't forceful, but each word landed like nails into the wooden floor. "I'd like a black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of apple pie." Derek opened his mouth, as if to say something, but no sound came out. His hands tightened slightly, then fell limp, and his eyes no longer knew where to look. No words were spoken, but Michael's subtle nod without a smile shifted the atmosphere like a sudden change in weather. Behind him, Linda slid the glass tray of pastries back into place. The motion seemed casual, but the dry, sharp sound of it hitting the wooden counter landed like an invisible slap across the silence that had stretched on for far too long. Michael paid it no mind. He pulled out the chair and sat down slowly. The chair made a soft noise, but it was enough to draw a few more glances from nearby customers. No one spoke, but everyone felt that something wasn't right. Some regulars looked at each other, then began whispering. "Who is that man?" a woman murmured. "Doesn't look like a Vulcan." In the corner of the room, Ricky, the young staff member, who had been sent to the stockroom earlier, quietly returned, still holding the crate of milk he hadn't yet put away. He stood just behind the kitchen door, watching Michael's every move, but Michael's eyes no longer paid attention to Linda or Derek, or even the murmurs. He looked out the window, where the harsh midday sunlight streamed through each square pane, casting angular shadows of tables and chairs onto the wooden floor. In the sen inexing way that his own shadow stretched long across the boards, overlapping with those of the other guests. Only one thing made it different. No one in that cafe knew that the man they had just asked to move was the very one who laid the first foundation stone of the cafe they were now sitting in. The man who 15 years ago once said, "Every guest is a story, and a story should never be turned away, just because of how it walked in." "Ager." Linda approached again, this time no longer with feigned casualness, but with a kind of masked hostility hidden beneath professional formality. "Sir, I've made the policy very clear. If you're unwilling to change tables, I have the right to refuse service." Michael turned his head, slowly lifted his gaze, and let his eyes rest on Linda's face for a long beat. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice almost like a Kiat monologue. "And I know exactly why you believe you have that right." Linda swallowed hard, her lips pressed tightly together. A soft click broke the silence. It was the sound of a fountain pen cap being removed from Michael's shirt pocket. He took it out, along with a simple silver card. No logo, no name, just a small QR code tucked in the lower corner. Linda looked at it, confused. Michael gently placed the card on the table. "You should keep this card," he said calmly. "It'll be necessary for the call you're about to receive." Derek stood frozen. From the back, Ricky tugged lightly at a colleague's sleeve. All conversations in the cafe ceased. Even the light pouring through the window seemed to still in that very moment. An apple pie, a cup of black coffee, and a seat that wasn't allowed. The issue wasn't the rules. It was how people chose to treat one another when they didn't know who the other person truly was. And Michael, as he picked up a glass of water someone had quietly placed beside him, smiled, not because he had been served, but because he knew what needed to be seen had finally revealed itself. Just as Michael set the card down, a soft chime rang out from the POS system behind the counter, a gentle ting like a whisper. Linda flinched and turned. The screen lit up, then faded into a deep crimson red. A line of text appeared. Alert. Owner access detected. She blinked. Her heartbeat quickened. A cold rush crept down her spine. Her hand, still resting on the counter, began to tremble slightly. Derek, still rooted in place, glanced toward the screen. His mouth fell open. Ricky, now fully out of the kitchen, instinctively pulled out his phone, but didn't dare lift it to film. He only managed to snap a photo of the screen before it disappeared. Linda turned back to Michael. This time, her eyes were no longer icy. They were filled with panic. She swallowed hard, opened her mouth to speak, but Michael was already standing. He wasn't in a hurry. One step, then another. As he passed the central table, where a few regulars sat, an older man instinctively shifted aside, not because he was asked to, but as if making way for something greater than himself. No one said a word, but everyone was watching. Michael walked up to the counter. He didn't need to touch a thing. Right then, the glass door at the front opened. A woman in a gray blouse stepped in, hair neatly tied up, tablet in hand. Elena, his senior assistant. "Good afternoon, Miss Linda," Elena said, air voice soft, but edged like velvet-wrapped steel. "I represent the legal and HR team from New Dawn headquarters. We've reviewed the entire incident via the internal camera system, and I'm here to officially inform you, you are immediately suspended." Linda's mouth fell open. She looked around, to the customers, then to Michael, then to Elena, but there was nothing left to grasp onto. No defense. No apology quick enough to save her. "This can't be. I was just following protocol," she stammered. Michael didn't look at her. He simply turned to Elena and said quietly, "Begin a full assessment of this branch's staff. Keep only those who truly understand why we exist. For the others, let them choose a different path." Elena nodded and opened her tablet. She spoke into her Bluetooth mic. "Activate Objective Transparency Protocol Code 4B. Call in the training team. Suspend all operations at this branch for 48 hours for restructuring." Immediately, the cafe lights blinked once, a subtle signal that the system had shifted into emergency oversight mode. The remaining staff began to rise, unsettled and unsure. Derek glanced at Linda. She averted his gaze. Ricky stepped forward, trembling, but for the first time, finding his voice. "Mr. Foster, I'm just a new hire, but I know what happened today wasn't right." Michael turned to him, his expression softening. "Which is exactly why you'll be the first to join the retraining session this afternoon," he said. "Integrity is the only foundation we can use to rebuild a system worth trusting." Derek bowed his head. Linda retreated behind the counter, her eyes hollow, her hands clenched tightly together. Michael said nothing more. He reached for his gray knit cap resting on the counter, pulled it on, and looked around the cafe, a space that once stood for aspiration, for peaceful mornings, for warm apple pie and black coffee, unsweetened. A cafe might be judged by its menu, but a system is judged by how it responds when faced with silent injustice. He turned to Elena and said simply, "I want to be here when the team starts. No Zoom, no office, in person." Elena nodded, and just like that, no shouting, no table slamming, no insults hurled. Michael Foster changed the entire dynamic of a cafe with nothing but calm resolve and unwavering commitment to original values. Behind him, Linda sank into a chair, her eyes beginning to shimmer, not from anger, but because she knew this ending was fair, and it was also the beginning of something the cafe had long forgotten. Why customers walk in and why they choose to come back. Michael sat still. He didn't respond to Linda's veiled threat, didn't react like a disrespected customer seeking to defend himself. He simply set his glass of water down on the table, lifted his head. His eyes were deep and still like a lake just before the storm. No need to raise his voice. No need to explain. He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and took out his phone. An old model, not flashy, but one that had witnessed hundreds of decisions, shaping the destiny of the New Dawn brand. He dialed, just 4 short digits. After 2 rings, a clear female voice answered with conviction. "Yes, Mr. Foster, I'm here." Michael looked toward the counter. "Activate Protocol 7. The voice replied instantly. "Understood. Deployment team is en route to the Maple and Cream branch. Emergency level administrative override has been triggered." Michael folded the phone shut, set it on the table. Quietly, without a wasted motion. Then he stood up. No one quite understood what was happening, but the air in the cafe began to shift, like someone had quietly turned down the thermostat. Time itself seemed to thicken. Every passing second stretched thin, like a ticking clock with a muted heartbeat. Michael turned to face Linda. At this moment, his eyes were no longer those of a regular guest who had been inconvenienced. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the truth, remembered every detail, and was ready to deliver the final verdict. "You're Linda Sharp, correct?" he asked, voice low, slow, and sharp like a blade honed with care. Linda clenched her fists. Her chin lifted slightly in reflex, a shield of pride, but her gaze had already faltered. "I'm Michael Foster, founder of New Dawn Cafe." A pause fell over the room. A few customers lowered their spoons and looked up. Behind the counter, Ricky froze. The milk pitcher nearly slipped from his hand. Michael didn't need to say another word. Each sentence he spoke landed on the wooden floor, like a strike precise and irreversible. And this branch? He slowly swept his gaze across the room, from the dusty counter to the faded promo signs, was opened in the third year of New Dawn's journey with a promise that no one walking in with an honest heart would ever be turned away. Linda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Michael wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. All he needed was the truth, and the truth had already spoken for itself. In every action, in every word, in every glance exchanged during the last 20 minutes, what I've heard and seen here today isn't just a violation of policy, it's a violation of the human values this entire system was built on. A door opened. Elena, his senior assistant, stepped in, followed by two staff members in HR uniforms. They carried tablets, notebooks, and an internal badge scanner. No introduction was needed. Their presence alone turned every employee into a blank sheet of paper, still, quiet, waiting. Michael stepped back, giving the floor to Elena. But before doing so, he addressed the entire cafe, not just Linda now, but everyone. "If any of you have forgotten why we open our doors each morning, then today is the day to remember. A brand doesn't survive because of a price list. It survives because of how it treats those who walk in without a business card or a membership ID." Linda stood frozen. A bead of sweat ran from her temple, down her cheek. Elena continued, her voice calm but razor sharp. "By executive order, all morning shift personnel will be temporarily suspended, pending internal review. This location will be closed for 48 hours for mandatory retraining." End of. Derek stepped back. Ricky lowered his head, whispering a silent "thank you" that never quite made it into sound. And Linda finally managed to utter a few broken words. "Mr. Foster, I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Michael shook his head. "You didn't have to mean it. The fact that you believed you had the right to act that way, that's the real problem." He turned away. Behind him, no one spoke. No customer protested. No colleague rose to defend Linda. Because there was nothing left to defend. The curtain had fallen, and beyond the cafe lights stood a bare stage where the truth had no choice but to finally step into the spotlight. The air, seemingly frozen, cracked open by the soft clink of a spoon tapping a porcelain cup. Then a trembling voice rose from behind the counter. "Sir, Mr. Foster." Every eye turned toward the source of the voice, Derek. The young man, still wearing his apron, hair falling over his brow, his hands clasped tightly, as if holding himself together. He stepped out from behind the bar, no longer timid, no longer just following orders. He raised his head, and his eyes had changed. Not the fear of being fired, but something deeper, a clear sense of awakening. "I'm sorry I didn't realize sooner, but not just because you're the CEO. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to speak up when I saw something wrong." Derek's voice broke slightly, and for a moment, the entire cafe seemed to recede, leaving behind a space worthy of that confession. Michael didn't respond immediately. He stood still. Then, after a pause, he turned and faced the young man. "What's your name, son?" "Derek, sir." Michael nodded. "Courage is speaking up for what's right, even if it comes late. Thank you for not staying silent to the very end." Elena noted something on her tablet, but didn't interrupt. Just then, from the kitchen door, another employee stepped out. It was Anita, the barista. A woman in her 30s, hair neatly tied back, cocoa powder still dusting her hands. She gently set the steel milk frothing jug on the counter, then slowly stepped forward. I know I'll be reprimanded for not reporting anything sooner, but I didn't want to lose my job. I have 2 young kids. Still, I can't keep looking away, not when people are treated differently, just because of how they look, how they dress, or who they know. She didn't look at Linda. She looked straight at Michael. Michael didn't reply right away. He stepped closer. Only 2 steps between them now. The only thing we truly lose is when we lose ourselves. Ferd. He didn't raise his voice, but the words made Anita press her lips tight. A shimmer welled up in her eyes, catching the warm glow of the overhead light. Then another hand went up. This time it was Ricky, the stockroom worker, still holding the carton of milk. Sir, I'd like to say something too. You don't have to. Michael interrupted gently. You were the only one who never looked away, from beginning to end. Ricky looked up, startled. His mouth opened, then closed again. But if you want to speak, Michael added, his voice no longer like that of a founder, but more like an uncle, a teacher. Ricky took a deep breath. I just thought, if it had been my mom, or mi sister, treated that way today, I couldn't bear it. Michael placed a hand on Ricky's shoulder. A gentle squeeze. No words, but the look in his eyes said everything. No one moved. Linda still stood there, eyes blank, fists clenched, but without strength. Then an unexpected sound broke the silence. Applause, slow, deep, coming from the far corner of the cafe. It was a customer. Then a second. A group of 3 middle-aged guests near the window stood up. One of them, a man in a gray suit, spoke up. Mr. Foster, I've been a customer at this branch for 8 years. And today, for the first time, I saw the original light New Dawn used to bring. A Zenadine Doe. Michael nodded in thanks. Not grandly, but there was a quiet shimmer in his eyes. Sunlight outside streamed through the glass, falling upon the small wooden logo mounted behind the counter. The hand-carved words, ones Michael had written in brown ink years ago, read, "Serve the soul, not just the stomach." He looked up at it, then looked down at the staff, now silently standing in a line, not out of fear, but because they were listening, they were ready to be cleansed. Michael turned to Elena, gave a slight nod. Starting tomorrow, restructure the entire morning shift. Keep only those who choose to relearn from the beginning. And he turned and looked directly at Derek, Anita, Ricky. Give them the right to lead. Linda opened her mouth, but no one was looking at her anymore. Sometimes, a reckoning doesn't need to end with a roar. It only takes one person, standing quietly in a familiar cafe, to remind everyone that this place was built on trust, not payroll sheets. And today, after a cup of coffee and a seat that was not allowed, that trust had started to return. Michael didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need a scepter or a microphone to affirm his authority. His voice, low, clear, solid as marble, etched with the name of the one who founded a legacy, was enough. Miss Linda Sharp, along with the entire morning shift staff today, is hereby officially suspended, effective immediately, for discriminatory conduct in serious violation of New Dawn's service principles. Each word fell like a silent blade, not with a roar, but leaving an indelible mark on the wooden floor and in people's hearts. Linda didn't react right away. Her face lost its color in the silence. But this time, her eyes didn't search outward for someone to save her. They turned inward, where shock was slowly transforming into a painful realization. The false authority she had clung to was nothing but a hollow shell. As Michael finished speaking, a movement stirred near the entrance. Rachel, senior supervisor for the Eastern Internal Region, stepped in. Tall, composed in a charcoal gray suit, a thin-framed pair of glasses perched above her name badge, clipped to her breast pocket. Behind her followed 2 HR officers in neat uniforms. Rachel didn't need to introduce herself. She simply raised an open file folder and declared firmly, "The suspension decision has been approved through emergency protocol. We will now begin collecting statements, internal notes, and extract all security camera footage within the next 2 hours." A tap on her tablet screen. Rachel's professional gaze swept across each silent face. No one objected. Not a single voice rose in protest. Derek stood still, Ricky remained gripping the now warmed milk carton in his hands. Anita quietly removed her apron and folded it, as if wrapping up a part of her past. Michael turned to address the entire cafe, now silent, but with everyone focused intently on his every word, as though they were witnessing something far greater than just a restaurant policy being enforced. The Maple and Cream branch will temporarily close for the next 24 hours, not as punishment, but for recovery. Example, he walked a slow circle around the bar counter. His hand brushed along the wooden surface, a fine layer of dust beneath his palm, serving as evidence of the quiet neglect that had overtaken a place once brimming with pride. This afternoon, I will personally lead the first retraining session. Any staff member who still believes in this brand, return at 2 p.m., not as someone being supervised, but as someone chosen to help us begin again. Kazim. His words were not just an announcement, they were an opportunity and a purification. A brief silence followed. Then from the corner of the barista station, Joseph, the oldest employee, with 12 years at this branch, quietly removed his barista cap. His eyes were red, but he said nothing. He only bowed his head deeply. A single tear fell silently onto the wooden floor, blending with the slanted noon sunlight, streaming through the glass windows. At the back, Derek lowered his head. His heart stirred. It wasn't shame. It was a feeling of being cleansed. A chance for redemption, not meant for the flawless, but for those brave enough to stand still. While everything was falling apart, Rachel signaled the HR team to begin. One activated the scanner, the other opened a notebook for internal records. Everything proceeded swiftly, but never coldly. Every gesture carried a tone of necessity, no longer just an internal review, but a spiritual surgery for a branch that had lost its soul. Michael took his eyes off the barista station and walked back to the spot where he had stood at the very beginning. The small table by the door where it all started. With an apple pie and a black coffee, he sat down. No more commands, no more explanations, just observation. But this time, his gaze wasn't looking for flaws. It was searching for seeds, brave enough to grow back from the very soil they once helped harden. Anita stepped quietly back into the inner area, but her eyes still looked outward, like an unspoken vow. Ricky, though silent, took off his old name tag, placed it gently on the table, and whispered, "If we're starting over, I'll be here." The wall clock struck 12 noon. The cafe was no longer filled with chatter, only the quiet breaths of people witnessing a true transformation. Michael looked out the window. A passerby walked their dog across the street. A breeze stirred the wooden sign outside the cafe, and something like the long-lost heartbeat of new dawn was beginning to wake up. A soft click came from the left. Michael turned his head. Derek, still in his dark apron, a streak of milk on the fabric, was standing right beside his table. Not because he'd been called over, but because he chose to walk up. His hands trembled slightly as he undid the top button of his uniform shirt. His lips pressed together, trying to hold back something swelling in his throat. May I say something, Mr. Foster?" Michael gave a slight nod. Derek inhaled deeply, eyes avoiding direct contact. But when he spoke, the words burst out. Fast, urgent, no longer premeditated. "I know I should have spoken up earlier today. When I saw how Linda treated you, I should have said something. I should have done something." Michael didn't interrupt. He tilted his head slightly, listening intently. Derek clenched his fists, his fingernails pressing so hard into his palms that the skin turned pale. "I won't pretend I'm innocent, but if you still believe New Dawn deserves another chance, then I'd like to believe I do too." End quote. Silence lingered for several seconds. The air seemed to thicken. Michael didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached for the spoon beside his now cold black coffee. His eyes never left Derek's face, but the slow, steady stirring, almost like reading the rhythm of a heartbeat, wasn't rushed, nor clouded by emotion. Then he set the spoon down, gently pushed the cup forward. "Sit down." Derek froze for a moment. Then, as if snapped out of his own current, he sat across from Michael. For the first time all day, the weight of hierarchy was set aside. "Do you know why I triggered an emergency protocol today?" Michael asked, his gaze sharp, drilling deep. Derek shook his head. Michael leaned back, fingers interlaced in front of his chest. Not because I was disrespected, but because I needed to know who, in this cafe, still had the clarity to distinguish between following orders and preserving dignity. He paused for a beat. You didn't challenge Linda, but you also didn't go along with her. You hesitated. Derek nodded, his face flushed red. Hesitation is the sign of inner conflict. And conflict means your conscience is still alive. It's not ideal, but it's a beginning. Michael pulled a small slip of paper from the notebook tucked inside his coat and placed it in the middle of the table. This is a temporary code to access this afternoon's training module. If you show up on time, you'll be the first to be offered the role of teaching assistant in the module titled Handling Ethical Situations on the Front Line, but only if you're brave enough to teach the very thing you once failed to do. Derek's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to speak, but Michael raised a hand to stop him. Don't thank me yet. Be there on time. And come with a heart that makes no excuses. Derek nodded. Not a grand gesture. No tears. Just a young man quietly accepting an invitation not to forget his mistake, but to turn it into the root of growth. Michael stood up, and this time it was Derek who held him back. Not with a hand, but with a sentence, his voice small but steady. Thank you for not judging who I am. Based on the one moment I stayed silent, Michael didn't turn back, but he paused for a few seconds, nodded, a silent pat on the shoulder from across the room. Then he walked out of the cafe. The breeze outside swept through as if the world itself was exhaling, relieved that the right choice had just been made. Michael didn't wait for anyone to open the door. He gently pushed the glass door of New Dawn Cafe and stepped out into the muted noon sunlight, where the light reflected off the dust on the signboard, as if wondering, how long had it been since this place was truly illuminated by truth? No one called him back. No one offered an excuse. No one patted his shoulder to soothe. But then, from behind, a faint sound was heard. Not a chair sliding, not a spoon hitting glass, but applause. One person, then another, not fast, not performative, but enough to silence the space, as if even the tiled floor was holding its breath. Michael paused at the edge of the threshold. He didn't turn around. He simply looked at the cafe sign reflected in the glass. New Dawn Cafe, lit by the sun, still in that same classic font he had once chosen when he staked his trust in life's work on this dream. Justice should never be a slogan on a wall. It must live in every morning greeting, in how you treat even the quietest customer. A soft breeze passed by. The signboard swayed gently, and the only thing he left behind wasn't an order, wasn't a threat, but a resonance. He whispered, just loud enough for himself to hear, a brand doesn't die because of mistakes. It dies when no one dares to correct them. And then he walked away. He didn't need anyone to walk beside him. No orchestral swell, no rousing final speech, just the steady footsteps of a man who had seen the cracks clearly and chose not to ignore them, as too many had before. Justice is action, not a slogan. Michael didn't make promises, didn't offer grand declarations. He acted immediately, decisively, without compromise. True power doesn't need a stage. He walked in like a customer, but walked out a true leader, leaving behind real change without needing to assert his title. Quiet, but resounding. No anger, no shouting. His calm exposed an entire system of indifference, using only silence, the kind no one could argue with. A cafe can open its doors every day, but its spirit only lives if someone dares to keep the flame alive